Hi, my name is David Smith. I've been at Anaplan about 4 years now, and I'm a Vice President in the Operational Excellence Group. My main focus in this group is to redefine the way we model, so a new initiative around modelling standards, the way we build, effectively, and we're looking at performance, usability and sustainability within there. So welcome to my Anaplan Ask Me Anything. It's the first in the series. So when you're ready, Anaplanners, ask me anything. So the first question is from community member Lynn, who's asked a question about protecting the data in a version when we change the forecast cycle. So we can actually use a little known feature in Anaplan called formula scope for this. What it means is that the formula will actually only work on a specific version that we choose and not applying to all versions, which would, as you said in the question, change all the previous versions. So it's probably easier if I actually show you that so they can see where you change that in the blueprint of a model. So as you can see on the screen here, we have just some data. I've got just two forecast versions. If we look at the versions tab, you can see we have March and April forecast. So we are currently in our March forecast, and you can see that I've ticked the current version tab. At the moment, my formula in the blueprint, if we go into there, you'll see it applies to all of the versions. I can now change that on here, and I have some different choices. So for the purpose of this, I'm going to use the current version. When I change that, you'll see that I now have the formula that's applying in the March forecast. If I actually click on the April forecast, you'll see at the top here, there's no formula in there. So what's actually happening there is the formula is only applying to the March forecast. So let's assume now that we roll the forecast over and I change my current forecast into April. And what I'll also do just to protect it is actually make sure that I turn the timescales off in March, so nobody can now edit March, and I'll make sure that my April forecast is actually able to be edited. So what's happening now is the other way around. I now have a formula in April. I have no formula in March. So if I want to go and change my data now, and I'll change my drivers or my calculations or whatever I'm doing, so here I'll change this. You can now see that the formulas in here have changed. So I now have April forecast updated based on my latest data and forecast drivers, but my March data is protected. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so community member Ethan Rold has asked a question about how do I manage my environment if I don't have ALM? So if you remember way back before we had ALM, this is a pain and there's no easy way to get around this. So what you don't want to do is make any of these changes in your production model, because if you start making changes and you get them wrong, your users are going to be upset because you're going to just disrupt their planning process, which is just not good. So always have a development model and do the changes over there and make sure that you're testing those changes. You're not disrupting the users, so you're going to be safe. If you can, try and keep some notes, some detailed notes of what you're actually changing. It will help you when you actually need to promote those changes, because there is no alternative other than to promote those again manually. But what I would say is communicate with your users, make sure that you're telling them what's happening, take the model offline, get them out of the model, because you really want some space to do these changes and check that you've got them all right. Make sure that the numbers are the same, the change you're expecting to see. But really what we should be looking to do is see whether you can get ALM. So what I would say is talk to your account executive. ALM is available in most of the pricing editions out there. So talk to them to see whether there's a way you can actually transition into one of those new editions and get the benefits of ALM. So just before we go on to another question, from the related question, what are the benefits of ALM? So why should you move? Well, you don't have to worry about all those changes because you make the changes in your development environment and then you can just promote them straight through with a few clicks of a button, no repetition, total security. You know that you don't have to get anything wrong between one and another. The other benefit is you can actually have segregation of duties. So you can actually keep your development environment separate to your production environment, making sure different sorts of people don't have access to the different sorts of data. You may have a development team offshore or in another part of the business that you want to make sure they don't have access to your production environment. So that's a big security concern. The other thing you can do is you can check what's changed between different versions. So these changes you've made, you can actually track those. So if somebody says, well, what have you changed? You can run a report that will tell you what's changed. And finally, probably one of the big ones is you can't change what you're not supposed to change. Deployed mode is one of the big things within your production model, and that means that even as an admin, you can't actually change the structures of the model inadvertently. It's protected from you, so you know that your model is going to stay and get the integrity. So we had a follow-up question, which was from community member Justin H., which talked really about, okay, I've got ALM, but I've got quite a complicated development setup. So I've deployed it, I've got changes that I need to make. sort of as a main development path. And then I've also got little changes I need to make quickly, and I have a switchover period that I need to make sure those, and it is difficult. So when we first launched ALM and these questions were coming up, we've developed some best practices, which we'll link to on the video. They're on community. There's a couple of posts that we put in there around how do I manage this. And the switchover one, for example, using revision tags, you kind of set your switchover periods up front first. Give yourself a space to develop in, then you can develop, and it gives you a window of some changes you can make, maybe 6-8 weeks if you've got a window like that. The other one is, how do I do these hot fixes where I've got a lot of development that's gone on and now I need to do a quick fix? We again developed a solution which I christened Back to the Future because it's a bit involved. You go backwards and forwards between revisions and restores. And again, all the details are on community, so I won't bore you all with that now. But those two are how you manage the environment. And one of the follow-up parts of the question was, how should I structure my models? How should I structure my workspaces? So picking back up on that segregation of duties piece, I would always advise you have a development environment in one workspace. Testing environment you could put in there. Maybe you want a test environment in another workspace, but that again comes down to your size of models and your kind of IT architecture. Keep your development environment in a workspace separate from your production environment, because then if you do decide you want to have segregation of duties with different people, then you can. And with workspace to workspace synchronization, it's fine. In terms of how many models, I would always have a development model that feeds your production model and also feeds your test models. I like to have a development model that is the ultimate source of all the models. So you feed your development model into your test model, and your test model is treated like a production model. So, we have lots of sports analogies. If you've seen Frank talk, he talks about hockey. Well, I'm a basketball fan, and my basketball coach told me to take my game shots in game positions at game speed. You want your test environment to mirror your production environment. So put it in deployed mode, copy it from your production environment. That is your test model, and feed it from your development model. When you finish with it, you can throw it away if you want. You could reuse it. I prefer to have my development model feeding both the test and the production. Yes, you can link all the models together and feed your production from test, but I don't think that's a good idea. I think it's better to keep that separate, because you can throw it away and start again. You can have multiple test models at different revisions, and all of those will effectively be feeding off the same development model. So there are a number of ways of configuring things. There's also a lot of information on community around some of the best practices around how to set up your revision tags regularly, how to make sure you get successful synchronizations. So I would encourage you to have a look at the ALM best practices pages on community, and there's a lot of stuff there that can help you. So we got a question from community member apologies if I got your name wrong, but you know who you are. It's on the community page, you can see who they are. And they had a question was, which formulas should we avoid for best performance? And before I go on to some of the specifics, I want to take a little step backwards in terms of, as I mentioned at the beginning, one of my big initiatives at the moment is to look at the modeling standards. And the reason for that is that, as I said, I've been here 4 years. And 4 years ago, the size of the models we were dealing with, the size of the customers we were dealing with, the size of the data we were dealing with was so much smaller than we're dealing with now. And the engine was such a good engine. It just took all the rubbish we threw at it, all the constructs that were wrong. It just said, yeah, that's fine. Whereas now, with the size of the list we're looking at and the data sets, you're seeing some performance issues with some of these formulas. So the big push at the moment for what I'm doing is to go back to this and saying, okay, let's find out what is not good and actually start telling you about this. So it's perfect timing, so thank you for the question. The main thing I would say is there's a couple of sort of specific points. It's not necessarily a formula we shouldn't use. It's combinations of formulas that cause the problems. Combinations and nesting of formulas, putting everything into one place. Historically, we used to try and cram it all into one line item to save some space on workspaces. But what we're finding with these bigger models now is that the calculations are having to do so much work. So combining sums and lookups, for example, is a known performance issue. Try to split those up into separate lines. Don't have too many expressions within the formulas. So we see a lot of formulas with lots and lots and lots of if statements in, lots and lots of expressions within there. Break those up into separate chunks, because actually the problem with having all of that in one place is that the engine has to do all of the calculations because it doesn't know any of the component parts in one go. So really try and break them up. And the other big one that we found out quite recently is look at the expression within there and look at how it applies to the dimensions. So use that applies to, because if the expression that you've got in there doesn't apply to the dimensionality of the line, take it out, because it's having to do the calculation more times than it wants. And particularly if you're going to use that calculation again in another part of the model. So what we're trying to say to people is really think about the calculations. If it's a common calculation that you use many times, put it somewhere and then use it once. Because the more times you have a calculation in there, the more times it calculates. So nobody wants to do any more work than you want to, so let's try and make the engine a bit more easy, and let's take the calculations out and put them separate. So we've got a question from community member Pete Amundsen, who's asking about how do we deal with the situation of signage of negative numbers, where we actually need them to be in the total, so we need 150 and showing 50. Maybe a particular US thing. It's not something I've come across in the UK quite so much. And he had a couple of workarounds in the question, and the question was specifically have we seen any other ways of doing it? So the short answer is no. There isn't really another way around it at the moment. It is a limitation that we see. So those workarounds are quite good for you. So if you are struggling with them, I would look at those workarounds because they are useful for you. But what I would say is that I've spoken to the product team. Part of my role is to act as this liaison between the customers and community and the product team to feed some of this back, to try and give the real examples of why we need these. So I've spoken to the product manager when this question came in specifically just to see where we are, and it is something that we do have on the roadmap. It is something we're thinking about. There are a couple of options we've got there, so I've kind of kicked that off now to say, okay, let's see if we can get this in the product to try and deal with some of these situations. So I hope that helps. We have a question from Ann Cooper, a community member, who's asked me what my favorite forthcoming feature is. And we also have a question from Starchild, who's asked specifically about breakback and dynamic cell access and how to find more information about it. Well, 2 in 1. Dynamic cell access is the feature I'm most looking forward to. For those who know me, I've championed this feature for 4 years. As soon as I finished the training for my first week in, I'd used it in a previous product and said, we need this feature. So I am so happy to see it. It is a incredibly flexible feature that will allow us to control the access at a granular line item level within a module, even by user, to make sure that we can the data they can see, or the data they can write to, or even the data that they can't see. And it's configured based on a Boolean flag in another module. So incredibly flexible, incredibly powerful. And those of you who know have tried to kind of control user access from a approvals process or from a locking down actuals, just know how difficult it is. Conditional formatting left, right, and center, extra line items, just lots of actions and processes. It's a real headache to try and make it work effectively. This gets rid of all of that. So it's a super exciting feature. So excited about it. It will change the way we model, definitely, which is massively beneficial. It simplifies it too, which one of our values is simplify as we innovate. Perfect, because this really is a super duper feature. The specific question from Starchild was, how do I find out more about it? Well, this product is available in early access, so that's the reason why there's nothing on community yet, because that's only general access. And the second part of that question was around breakback. Well, the early access that we released didn't have breakback in it. But again, through the feedback from the customers and from people using it, we've identified that, yep, that is a big thing people wanted. We wanted to get something out quickly, so we did it. And we're taking the feedback and we said, yep, okay, we can put breakback in if that's what everybody wants to behave. We needed to double check the behaviors as what people expected. So that should be coming out in a forthcoming release. But for me, it's a game-changing feature, and I'm just so pleased that it's in this system, and we've taken the feedback from you guys as well. So we have another question from Starchild, really valid question actually, about how the process should work for tidying up your models and keeping them clean. And part of what I'm working on as this standard, as I mentioned earlier, is only doing what's necessary. So tidying up is a really key part of making your models perform well, because we often see lots of redundant formulas and line items that can have a big impact on your model opening and model performance, and they're not really needed. So the question was specifically, how do I do it? Well, everyone, you should try and do it as you go along. So if you know this is a temporary calculation, or it's a temporary action, it's a discipline thing. You just have to delete it when you're finished. But if you think there's something you're going to leave for a little while, what I would do is essentially just prefix it with delete or temporary, or something that will give you an indication that this shouldn't be there, later on. And you just have to be systematic, just every week, every month, or whatever it might be. Just go through and try and clear things down. The advantage we now have with some of the new reference by columns that have come in the product recently now allow you to see whether this formula is being used. Because really, if you go through your blueprint and look through, unless the module's on a dashboard, if it's not referenced by anything, you do have to question why it's there. So it is a really important feature, to try and go through, tidy up your models, make sure you don't have any redundancy in there, because it does have an impact. So we all want models to perform well, and this is a good way of making sure models perform better. So bonus question time. Some of you may have heard the term discoing your models and disco in relation to Anaplan if you've been to the hubs or some of your colleagues or some of your co-workers. And you may be thinking, so does this mean I've got to dress up in sparkly suits and flares? No, but if you want to, that's fine. No prejudice there. So what disco is about is part of the standard that I'm looking to push out in terms of getting you to think about how you build your models right before you start touching the keyboards. So this is back at the beginning, when you're doing your requirements, really thinking about, okay, how is this model going to evolve? So we wanted to come up with a way of saying, how do I actually, tell people how to model this? So DISCO is a really good acronym because it's easy to remember and actually it covers most of the main parts of it. So I'm going to just take you through what essentially the elements of DISCO are. The first one is data. This is really where you start. So all models need something. Very rarely do you have a model where users go straight in and just type information in. There's nearly always something. That may be transaction data from a general ledger. It may be opportunities from Salesforce. It may be information from employee headcounts or whatever it might be. So that's generally, if you're thinking about your design flow or your model map, that'll be the top left-hand corner or the top or the right left-hand side, however you draw them out. And this is probably your transactional data. Your users aren't really going to need to be in here. You may probably even have this in a data hub. And again, it's recommended that we try and do that because if you have information or data that's used across different models, you want to put it in one place. So put it in a data hub and then we can feed that across the different models. The I is for input. So this is where your users are coming into the system for the first time. So think about making that module user-friendly. You might use sort of 2 specific dimensions. Just try and keep it for input though. Don't try and clutter it up with other pieces of information. Don't put calculations in there. Don't put reporting outputs or KPIs in there. This should be your users going into the dashboards where they first interact and the inputs. It's very easy to try and put everything in one place. But actually it's much better from a data flow perspective and an understanding point of view if you can actually try and take it out. So we want you to look at it from an input perspective, do dashboards really. Where are the users going in? And then you put the system for the S of the DISCO. And what this is these are your other pieces. So they're not really data. This is your mappings and your lookups and any attributes that you may have about some of your big lists. So all of the details around your products, your employees, your customers, whatever it may be. Because one of the things that we mentioned earlier about the breaking out the formulas and only using them once, a lot of these calculations you will use multiple times. You will look up what the parent of a product is, or what the region for a customer is, or that sort of stuff. You want that information in one place and reference it many times. So the data and the system are kind of the 2 overarching pieces of structure that you need within your models. The heart of the model is obviously the calculations. This is where the work gets done. This is where, again, you don't really want your users in here because these are your black boxes. These are the calculations. And what you need to be thinking about here is trying to get your structures together. So again, thinking about the commonalities, thinking about how the engine works well, it works best when it's doing like for like. So you want to try and get all of your calculations aligned in the same sort of thing. Try and get everything in one place so that you know if you're going to do a calculation that relates to customers and products, you know where that structure is. It makes it easier to maintain. And also look in here to try and optimize things. Look at the structures, look at the summary options, look at some of the optimization techniques that we've got on community around making this the most efficient structures you can. You don't need users to be in here really because this is a calculation. And finally, we come to obviously the output, the O, right-hand side, bottom of your model map, whatever it should be. This is the outputs. This might be files for export, this might be reporting. And again, this really should be data flows in. You shouldn't really have anything going out of this. We don't want the sort of looping going on with the model maps and the structures. It doesn't make a difference on performance particularly, but it's just easy to understand. And what I would say is these are guidelines. So yeah, there are going to be times when you need to make things link together and you need to have data flows going backwards and forwards. But as a design principle, try and work on this first. So you should end up, if you look at how that might look, and again, you won't have a model map that's that simple, but the principles are the same. So across the middle, you have inputs, calculations, outputs. That's how most models work. That's probably how most people think. And overarching on the top and bottom are the other elements that support that. So your data is being referenced everywhere. Your system and your mappings and your lookups, they're being referenced everywhere as well. So if you can look at your models from the beginning, or even actually now looking at them, once they're in production, take a step back, look at how your models are structured, split them up into different modules, split them up into different pieces. Breaking stuff up is good for performance, it's good for understanding, it's good for maintenance, all the things that are in the standard that we're trying to work towards. So, if you talk to people now about when they're saying disco their models, we've christened this new verb, this is what it's all about. So this will help you with more structured models, and ultimately it'll be better performing models. So as we said before, take a step back, look at your models, and try and use this as a design principle going forwards. So thank you for watching my Ask Me Anything. Please visit community to see what's up next, and please take the survey to let us know what you thought. And finally, go forth and disco.